Okay. All right. You can go to I'm Jeff Solka at NSWC Dahlgren. So basically, the very brief exposition I'll provide today really just provides me a convenient foil with a small example that I can talk about to just talk about some of the problems that we've certainly faced in conducting analyses that we've done. I guess, and we've been kind of working in this area since about 2004. So the group that I'm in is made up of computer scientists, statisticians, mathematicians. My PhD was in computational statistics in '95, which I guess in many ways grew to become the field of data analytics. So this toy problem we're looking at today is just a small set of data, kind of focused a little bit on text data mining. The way we have access to the data is through our collaborations with a governmental consortium that has purchased the data for data analytical purposes. That's the way we have access to the data, really. So there's certainly contaminants in this particular data, being image retrieval and video retrieval. We don't necessarily think about those, although I guess it was the case that latent diversity allocation came out of the image processing area. So maybe it's not necessarily surprising we pulled in some of the image and video stuff. And then, of course, the caution, of course, is because we know not all databases are perfect, and database coverage is not uniform across all countries. So as statisticians say, absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. So this is just a simple world map of publications. You know, we just bend it into counts to kind of just show participation for this toy problem here across the world. You know, it's kind of interesting. Many times these maps look very similar once we look into the breakdown, although there can be some normal deviations from the pattern that one normally sees as far as the United States, followed, say, by China, followed by other things, depending on the topic of interest that we're looking at. Obviously, one can do simple calculations such as an H-index, which I'm sure everybody on the dial-in is intimately familiar with. You know, certainly we're looking for alternative measures to measure the quality of publications at the author level or institution or country level, alternatives to the H-index. And although we haven't done extensive, large amounts of work in the area, we have done some work in the area of citation prediction, things like that is one way of quantifying potential impact, although that problem is certainly, I don't consider to be fully solved. Particularly if one wants to put confidence bounds on the prediction that one makes. But this is a sort based on H-index for the topic we're talking about today. And then, of course, similar sorts based on institutional names. The slides I'm showing today are some dated by time, but this is kind of what I have to show today anyway. We have made progress in terms of institution disambiguation, solving those sorts of issues, but even in this particular case, we see, for example, we're looking for interest in text work, and Penn State certainly is one of the ones to think about, kind of at the top of the pyramid there, at least with regards to text data mining, some other work, CiteSeer X, for example. So this isn't necessarily out of the ballpark, kind of crazy. And then, you know, authors. I guess one of the ones, if we look down a little bit, Michael Berry is somebody who I've had dinner with on a number of occasions, so seeing him show up for information retrieval and linear algebra really makes sense, really. Some of the other authors that have shown up here are pretty good, certainly if we'd gone down a little bit further, and this data that we're showing today in the analysis is probably about maybe 5 or 6 years old. So obviously there's other people that have certainly percolated to the front. In this case, as you see at the bottom, I didn't disambiguate the authors, just as I just didn't disambiguate institutions on the previous slide. We made some progress with regard to author disambiguation, but depending on the author set and what country we're interested in, author disambiguation can be more difficult at times than others, depending on the names that we're dealing with and what country of interest that the authors are involved in. And so this is just, once again, drilling down from country to institution to author. And then within the venue of the tool that we've developed, this is a simple search. So there was just a search for document retrieval. This was, like I say, version of the tool is about 5 years ago. So we can bring back certainly records that contain that. And, we have some capability to find more like this based on some certain simple cosine similarity measures and things like that, or potentially even bringing in more complex methodologies of measuring paper-to-paper sorts of distance measures. And certainly some of that information goes into making the soup at the beginning when we're building an index and deduplicating as we kind of go along. Now, kind of bringing a little bit more attention into more speculative sorts of things. Certainly, given the fact that I would say our interest is probably, I'd like to say 50% analytical, so 50% algorithm development. I'm not sure exactly if we always necessarily meet that kind of breakdown, but certainly given our interest in computational statistics, statistical pattern recognition, data mining, we've done a bit of thinking in terms of rendering of the individual records. In this case, we're rendering individual publications in a spectral-based graph projection, a Fiedler projection, and we've covered them based on an A-cluster solution. So, the exact methodology to render clusters or individual records in a projected space of 2 dimensions is certainly still one of those things that requires some kind of study, if you will. We're going from a very high-dimensional space down to a lower-dimensional space. There's some advantages, say, comparing this Fiedler-based projection, say, against standard principal component analysis. But certainly we've looked at other alternative projection methodologies, including ones based on minimal spanning trees, ones based on other algorithmic algorithms that claim superior projection in the face of large numbers of observations. But this at least gives you a way to kind of look at the data, interact with it at the level of clicking the dots and look at titles, stuff like that. Now we're kind of entering into the realm of visualization of cluster structure as projected in 2-dimensional plots. We can use some of the similar ideas in terms of multidimensional scaling, principal component analysis, other projection strategies, be they linear or nonlinear. Ultimately, the axes are somewhat hard to interpret, depending on how we do it. But hopefully, things that have similar content are kind of near one another. So in this particular case, we have a small number of clusters that have just been projected, and we use a spring-based layout methodologies to kind of prevent overplotting and things such as that. So this works pretty good. There was actually at the top of the screen on the previous plot of the music cluster that somehow kind of got brought in. And all we've really done here is to adjust our projection so as to take that music cluster off the top of the screen. We'll see a little bit later in my exposition today a cluster projection that has more clusters. And certainly one of the things we've thought about is given 10,000 of these ovals rather than 16 or 32 or 64, what does one do in that particular case? And we've done some work looking at what I'll call meta-cluster structure, or forming clusters of clusters, so that we kind of get regions rather than clusters in order to characterize large data sets involving, say, millions of records. So that's certainly an ongoing area of interest. Cluster solution. We use different toolkits, different methodologies. We've certainly looked into model or topic-based clustering, shall I say, which is Slate and Dursley allocation. And I guess the only caution to the user there is depending on the inference task that one is attempting to perform as you go forward there, that solving the inverse problem to get your model for topic modeling can cause some issues in that it does have a stochastic nature. And in some sense, each time that you make a solution to the topic model, you get a slightly different solution. And then also, given the fact that the topic modeling, rather than this, which is hard clustering, the soft clustering interpretation of topic models in your display can be somewhat difficult. This is just another sort of idea, and it's certainly the human visual system is want to look at pictures, and software that we've developed certainly has some pictures in it. Some are better than others, but I think the power of the human visual system comes into play when one is allowed to interact with the data via the picture. In this case, obviously, like some of the previous work shown by some of my esteemed colleagues, Thomson we have basically a series of bumps corresponding to the various topics for this rather small data set, corresponding to the 16 cluster solution, wherein, depending on how we scale our peaks, we can get some feel about the number of records in each cluster, and maybe some feel about the semantic layout, depending on how we rendered here in this kind of bump plot. And then, certainly where some of the power comes in is the ability to query into the cluster solution by particular topic areas. In this case, we've queried into it, and then it's allowed us to basically, as part of the clustering methodology we use, it produces single, double, triple term phrases that are informative, descriptive, and discriminating terms that are informative. So we can get some of these triple term phrases to help us understand what's come back from the query, or what's happened when we drill down into the cluster solution. We certainly get things like breakdown by country, or and then over in the right are the actual records, where we have some measure, as indicated by the green bar, of how representative of the particular cluster that we're working with here that we have. And then the other thing is that, often in many cases we're certainly interested in what, if any, is any statistically significant, or maybe just any difference between the cluster breakdown in terms of institution or country. Is there really any significant difference? In this case, we see for this particular cluster, the United States, in terms of attribution, is documented in the database. We have 31 records, and China has 15. We're often interested in, is that breakdown, that multinomial kind of breakdown of country proportions, is it significantly different than that occurs across the corpus as a whole? So this, once again, we have ability to zoom in and out of this. Obviously, it doesn't show so well on the screen as we're seeing today. This is just a 64 cluster solution, giving us a little bit more fidelity with regards to the solution on a small data set. And then maybe kind of the more interesting thing is interacting with that and using color to show as we interact with that. We've done something very simple here, in that we've interacted to color the clusters by internal similarity as measured by average cosine similarity within the clusters. So this is kind of a silly thing, but at any rate, it does illustrate coloring via a condition measure, and it illustrates the use, of course, of the legend that we have at the bottom, where at the top we're capping by about 0.23 cosine similarity. So in my own mind, this ability to interact with the cluster solution in some sort of projected visualization space is really a good way to perform exploratory data analysis. Certainly a lot about data analytics has to do with exploratory data analysis, and once one has done that type of thing, then maybe you've discovered some signals or indicators or patterns that you want to calculate at scale across the whole data set. But often these come out of the initial interactions with the data. And in this particular case, we're actually coloring by occurrence of sponsor. Sponsor is one of the fields that is tracked within the data. So in this particular case, this is more of a pedagogical exercise rather than any particular interest. We merely searched to color the clusters by those that cite sponsorship from the National Research Council of Canada is kind of what we've done here. And you see the ones that have a higher proportion there are highlighted in red as compared to lower proportions that are highlighted in blue. So I think there's some mileage to these kind of interactions at the individual cluster level, or in the case of 10,000 clusters, at the cluster level. Use coloring to kind of indicate this conditioning to show us differential structure within the data set. And in this particular case, we've conditioned on a country. This now, we can see there's that one particular red cluster that seems to have the largest amount of content in terms of Australian authors. So once again, part of our interest is interest in the differential nature, the different types of capabilities of institutional or countries' portfolios as manifest by subsets of the data. In this case, a small data set, but that's okay, as manifest by subsets of the data. And we certainly thought a lot about and developed various visualization frameworks to try to tease out that information. This is one particular Australian paper that falls out of that particular down select, exploring criteria for successful query expansion in the genomic domain. Obviously, query development, query expansion, automated query development, those are all things that are certainly of interest, and certainly application of text data analytics to the bioinformatics area is something that's been going on for quite a while via programs like BioRat. Now, in this particular case, The other thing that we thought about a bit is how to bring time into things. And we've done a lot of thinking about that, and with regards to various methodologies. One can build topic models over time, for example. One can look at differential structure of keywords over time, find statistically significant changes in keyword structure over time. This is kind of like a poor man's version of that, merely conditioning on 2008, 2007, and then showing those records that have higher content for those particular years. So it's a poor man's way of fitting the data temporally to look at those clusters that may be more prominent for certain years as compared to other things. So not a bad idea. Certainly gives the human being some capability to do this. And then here's similarly, we've just conditioned on the case of a technical university, the Queensland University of Technology, to see kind of what their portfolio would look like for this 64-node cluster solution. And then we can also do things like condition on particular keywords to see maybe it is the case we're really interested in topic data models and where they occur. And then we can obviously kind of bring that map up by just searching or conditioning on those keywords within this particular framework. And then the other thing is that we can, and once again, since citations is a time series go up and go down. So even fitting something to the time series and quantifying growth, there's lots of different ways to do that. We've tried lots of different ways, but in this particular case, we're kind of looking at those areas that have a higher growth rate. So often the recency of particular research, the recency of the citation to the research, the growth rate. These are some of the things that people kind of think about when coming to identify things that are kind of growing or emerging or potentially figures that measure of interest. And this is just literally conditioning on the United States in terms of our interests for this particular data set. And I've highlighted the one that was in red in this case is wireless sensor networks, information retrieval, wireless sensors. Certainly, as we all know, there's been a lot of interest in terms of that over the past 10 years in this particular area, really. So on the other slide, we're kind of looking at the general patterns. In this, we're looking on the things that we're not doing. So sometimes we may be interested in a much of where topic areas of particular entity sets, be the institutions, countries, are not doing, as opposed to the things that they are doing. So these are some areas that we don't seem to be well represented in. Obviously, vis-a-vis caveated on the data. It's kind of really tiny toy problem we're looking at. The other thing, and this is harder because it leads one into the realm of spaghetti diagrams, is to look at connections between things. Like, for example, drawing connections based on simple intersections or normalized intersections to show us clusters that have similar sponsorship. And that's what we've done here with the red line, showing us these are intersecting in terms of sponsorship. And then we can look at those cluster intersections in terms of breakdown by attribute and a little bit of information for those particular clusters in terms of descriptive terms is what I'm showing here. So sometimes we're interested in, hey, in these particular topic areas as identified by the cluster solution computed by the computer, these two clusters have similar sponsorship. Or in this case, we're looking at similarities between authors. And this is also a problem we've thought about a bit. Authors often change what they do as a function of their career. In fact, I published in organic chemistry, published in text data mining, I published in image and video processing, I published in bioinformatics, in a number of different areas. So authors' careers evolve over time. So looking at, say, intersections between different topical areas in terms of authors can be interesting. And this is just a look in terms of where we've identified two clusters with similar author structure. And this one seems to be certainly about multilingual sorts of processing, really cross-language exploitation, information retrieval, machine translation. And often, as we all know, there are these linkages between topics. Any cluster solution is only at a certain level of fidelity. And what level of fidelity that one should run is certainly, in many ways, an open question, whether even if one's using an Aki-Iski information criteria or Bayesian information criteria or some other criteria. And maybe this is kind of an interesting thing. This was actually, capability was developed for a different capability, but the idea is that to place two different cluster solutions is conditioned. In this case, we're conditioning on the United Kingdom documents in blue and the U.S. documents in red putting them in the same projected space, and to see if the location of the clusters does in some sense capture semantics of the difference. And sometimes what this allows us to do is to identify terms that are kind of country unique. You know, we refer to things as topic data modeling, latent Dirichlet allocation. It could be the case in Britain or other countries. They may use slightly different terminology, and that can be useful to kind of know what's going on with regards to the difference in terminology. The conclusion side says is that data analytics, text data analytics is good. Anybody who is just asking smart people what they should do and what they should be worried about and what they should invest in anymore without being informed by data in some sense, I believe here in the year 2015 that that's kind of silly, and we should all work together to make things better.